So there's a big open question that a lot of people ask us. If Ayurveda is effective, then why isn't it more available? You would assume that if there's this highly effective medical system that can solve a lot of the problems we're facing, then it would be more widely available and accessible and it'd be part of the system. And I think this is actually a really valid question because on the face of it, yeah, that seems like a correct answer. If something is valid and successful and works, then it should be more available. But in the case of Ayurveda, there's actually very specific historical reasons that make it such that it hasn't expanded inside the West and why we're trying to bring it and expand it into the West. And so to kind of dive into that, we have to give a little bit of deep historical context. Drawing back to the 1800s, when the British colonized India, Ayurveda was placed underneath the Western medical system and deemed inferior. And this was done both in the eyes of the general public, because the things that were British and Western were perceived as superior, and in the eyes of the ruling elite, most of whom were educated in British standard schools. And this had a lot of downstream consequences and has really only started to shift in the early 2010s in India as kind of decolonialization movements have begun to make their way into the public consciousness. But until the early 2010s and really the early 2000s, Ayurveda was perceived as an inferior medical system. This had a lot of downstream consequences. Because it was perceived as an inferior medical system, Ayurvedic doctors would get paid significantly less than Western doctors, which meant that anyone that was smart enough to become a Western doctor would become a Western doctor. And the people that weren't smart enough to become Western doctors would become Ayurvedic doctors. You can imagine, obviously, what the result of this would be, especially in the West as we think about how did this impact access to Ayurveda here? Because what that means is that both there's a lack of highly trained Ayurvedic doctors in the West because there's really a lack of highly trained Ayurvedic doctors in India. And the second thing is that the Ayurvedic doctors that did make it to the West likely may have been the ones that weren't able to make it into Western medicine in India because that's what they would have done if they were good enough. And so this led to a sort of a lower quality level of Ayurvedic doctors in the West as well, which led to decreased trust. Now, as I kind of alluded to, this has all started to shift in the late 2000s and early 2010s in India. The Indian government has invested hundreds of millions of dollars into Ayurvedic infrastructure and is really pushing it as a key component of healthcare in India going forward. And the tradition really was never lost. 700 million people use Ayurveda as their primary or secondary healthcare system in India. And so the revitalization is happening in India. But downstream of that, 150-year period in which it wasn't considered a real medical system, that impacted our access in the West. And kind of one component of that was what I talked about with the lack of access to highly trained Ayurvedic doctors. But the consequence of not having highly trained Ayurvedic doctors in the West was that we couldn't conduct the scientific research necessary to validate Ayurveda in the eyes of the medical community and the public. Taking one step back, kind of one question we can ask is, has Ayurveda been tested in the West scientifically and failed? Or has it not been tested at all? And the answer is actually that it hasn't been tested at all. There's been one NIH-funded study that collaborated between American physician scientists and Indian Ayurvedic physicians. It was run out of UCLA, out of the School of Medicine there, and it was a study for rheumatoid arthritis, and it found that the Ayurvedic approach for rheumatoid arthritis was as effective as the standard approach in conventional medicine with fewer side effects. And that approach is currently in a phase 3 clinical trial, and that's the only NIH-funded study we've ever had that's collaborated between Indian Ayurvedic physicians, which is where the expertise is, and American scientists, which is where the scientific expertise is. So I think that's pretty notable. The one other thing to say is that Germany, surprisingly, is 5 or 10 years ahead of the US in this, and actually the biggest medical faculty in continental Europe is located in Berlin. It's called Charité. And there they have an Ayurvedic treatment wing and a clinical trials department where they're starting to conduct rigorous outcomes-based research comparing Ayurveda head-to-head with conventional medicine. And they've released 2 studies in the last 5 or 6 years. They're just getting started. One on osteoarthritis and one on irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. And for both of those studies, they compared Ayurvedic treatment to Western medicine, the kind of state-of-the-art conventional treatment head-to-head. And in both of those studies, they found that the Ayurvedic treatment actually outperformed the conventional treatment by between 40 and 60%. And the first study on osteoarthritis actually led the German Society for Rheumatology to recommend Ayurveda as a complementary treatment for for osteoarthritis. Okay, now taking a step back from these clinical trial results, I think the question we should ask is, what should we take away from this? And I think viewing these clinical trial results from a statistical perspective, And what I mean by that is that we've tested this whole system of Ayurveda a few times in high quality clinical trials for different diseases. And this is a system that's been around for 3,500 or more years, is used by hundreds of millions of people in India, and has continuously been used as the medical system in that area. And so statistically, we would say that that's sufficient evidence for us to start to conclude that actually this whole system probably works. And that I think is the current state of the scientific literature. There's also a whole bunch of other studies on specific Ayurvedic medicines for particular conditions. And in the West, we've started to study kind of single isolated herbs from the Ayurvedic system. You've probably heard of ashwagandha, you might have heard of brahmi, and obviously there have been lots of studies on turmeric, and we're starting to see that even these single herbs have very, very powerful effects. And so what I would view Ayurveda as is something akin to the status of meditation in the research community 5 or 10 years ago. 5 or 10 years ago with meditation, a lot of people probably, honestly, it's kind of crazy to think about now, but at that point honestly thought that meditation was placebo or some kind of quackery. But we saw the early results start to emerge, and this was this again, another Eastern system coming mostly from Buddhism and Hindu yoga that hadn't really been tested yet in Western medicine. And as it started to be tested more, we started to realize that, this is actually extremely effective for doing things that we don't yet know how to do in the West. And so I think Ayurveda is in the exact same category as of right now. The research is going to start to accumulate over the next 5 or 10 years, both because Germany is already getting a head start on it, and us as well in the US, and we hope to contribute to that. And so that's our current perspective on the question, why isn't Ayurveda yet present in the US? We kind of deep dived into the scientific evidence there, but obviously because of the lack of scientific evidence, it hasn't gotten integrated in and accepted in the medical community, along with the fact that there just aren't very many Ayurvedic doctors.